Hi, everybody. Kim Sanford from the Spurlock Museum, Urbana, Illinois, University of Illinois. I'm the Assistant Director of Education and the Resident Storyteller. And today, the stories that we're going to be telling are about Anansi. Now, Anansi is a spider, and he is a trickster, well known from his Ashanti stories from Ghana. Now, Ashanti stories, especially Anansi stories, got spread very, very far across the world. First, when people from Ghana were brought to the Caribbean as slaves. And as those stories spread, Anansi's name got changed a bit. And I have a list here of different ways that Anansi's name is said in these other parts of the world where his stories were taken. He is Brunansi in the Virgin Islands. He is Anansi Drew in the Bahamas, Aunt Nancy in South Carolina, Chan Nansi in Aruba. He is Kwaku Anansi in Akanland, and Ba Anansi in Suriname. So lots of different ways of saying his name as his stories got passed along. And the first story that I'm going to tell today is a story about how Anansi gets the wisdom of the world, or how he gets a wisdom and it gets spread around the world. There are many, many versions of every Anansi story. So you might have heard this story before, but maybe not in this version. One of the things that I learned in reading more about Anansi is that it is thought that his father was the god Nyame, who was the god of the sky. And he is going to be part of one of the stories that we do. And in fact, the story about Anansi having the wisdom of the world, in other versions, they talk about the fact that all of the wisdom of the world actually comes from Nyame, that he has a big clay pot of them. This is a different version, but one that I also like, and one that I hope that you like too. So Anansi was very, very clever. He was very good as a trickster, but he knew he didn't have very much wisdom, that deeper knowledge. And so he thought it was time that he gathered some. And he thought about it for a while, and in the end decided he was going to get a big gourd. Now I have a picture of, upside down, a picture of some gourds here. And you probably are familiar with at least one kind of gourd, pumpkins. So it's this time of year is gourd time. And gourds are great in the fact that they have really, really sturdy shells. And as you can see, they can be carved into all different kinds of shapes. You can make spoons out of them and ladles out of them and bowls out of them, all kinds of good things. So Anansi decided to get a big gourd, hollow all of it out, and that's where he was going to keep all of this wisdom. And he went around to every house in the village and he asked everyone in every house, would they contribute a little bit of their wisdom? And so the people thought, well, if this is going to make Anansi wiser, this is a good idea. And so they each contributed their bits of wisdom and put them in Anansi's gourd. When he was finished, he thought, this is wonderful. I am now the wisest person in the world. And I've got to make sure that nobody steals this wisdom, that I have it forever whenever I need it. So I need to put it someplace safe. And he started walking around with this gourd and he started thinking, and he came to this really tall tree. That's where I'm going to put the wisdom, he said. So he got this big cloth and he wrapped it around his waist and knotted it. And then he put the gourd within that cloth right in front of his belly so that it would be nice and safe. And then he started going up the tree and he discovered it was very, very difficult with this big gourd, but he did the best he could trying to get hold with all those different legs and get up that tree. And after a while, he was huffing and puffing and sweating, and he heard the voice of his youngest son. And the youngest son said, Father, I have an idea. Wouldn't it be easier for you to climb that tree if you had the gourd on your back instead of tied to your belly. And Anansi just kind of stood there for a minute or two and didn't say anything. And then finally he said, son, I think it's time for you to go home. I'm sure your mother has some things that you could help her with. All right, father, said the youngest son, and he ran on home. Now Anansi took that big gourd and switched it, put it on his back, and indeed it was so much easier to do. But the whole time he's finally going up the tree, he's thinking about what had just happened. And when he got to the very top of that tree, he just shook his head. And he said, if my son, who does not have a gourd filled with the wisdom of everyone in our village, can figure out that I was doing it wrong and figured out how to do it right, having this big gourd with all this wisdom isn't going to do anybody any good, like me. So Anansi stood there at the top of the tree. He took off the webbing that he had put at the top of the gourd to hold everything in, and he just poured out all of that wisdom, and off it went and was spread like his stories all over the world. And that's our first story about Anansi and the wisdom of the world. Now, our next story is a short one, and it is called Anansi and the Witch. Now, do I need to show you a picture for these? No, we're good. So let's get started with the story of Anansi and the Witch. The witch really doesn't show up anywhere in the story, but something about her is very important, and this is it. You see, in the same village where Anansi lived, there was a witch, and the witch's name was Five. Now, the witch hated that name, and so she had put out this curse that anybody who said her name would fall asleep for a whole year. Now, during this time in this village, there was both a famine and a drought. There was very little food and very little water. Now, Anansi had a wife and lots and lots and lots and lots of children, and he was trying to figure out, how can I feed my family? They're very important to me. And he came up with this clever idea. He had this little bit of corn left, and he got it all together, and then he went outside of his house and he made 5 little piles of that corn, and he sat down on top of one of them. Now, the very first animal to come by, once Anansi had done this, was Mrs. Rabbit. And Mrs. Rabbit was looking at that corn, and Anansi said, would you like to have some corn for your family? And of course, Mrs. Rabbit was thrilled at that idea, and she hopped right over. And Anansi said, Mrs. Rabbit, all you need to do to get this corn for your family is tell me how many piles of corn are there. And so immediately Mrs. Rabbit, who counted very well, said, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as soon as she said 5, Mrs. Rabbit fell asleep. Anansi had now become a very good hunter without having to even use a weapon other than his cleverness. And so Mrs. Rabbit became dinner for Anansi's family for several weeks. But not long afterwards, those weeks were over, and Mrs. Rabbit had now been eaten. And so Anansi decided, well, I have to go out and I have to do this again. It worked so well the first time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different piles of corn. Anansi sat on one, and the next to come by was Mr. Squirrel. And same thing as with Mrs. Rabbit. Mr. Squirrel, do you need to have some corn here for your family? And Mr. Squirrel ran over and said, "Oh yes, 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 yes. I got my tree, but what I have been saving that there's very little left. There's just no food around, and yes, I would love, love, love to have some of your corn. It would be great." And so Anansi said, "All you need to get this corn, Mr. Squirrel, is tell me how many piles of corn there are." And Mr. Squirrel, also being a wonderful counter, went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Mr. Squirrel fell asleep. And Mr. Squirrel fed Anansi's family for several weeks. But it came that time again where Anansi needed to have food for his family. So he went and he put out those 5 piles of corn. And who should happen to come by next but Mrs. Goose? And Anansi said, "Mrs. Goose, would you like some corn for your family?" And Mrs. Goose flew over and said, "Indeed, I would, Anansi." And Anansi said, "All you have to do to get this corn is tell me how many piles there are." And Mrs. Goose, who knew, as most did, that Anansi was a trickster, figured, wait a minute, let me think about this for a second. Is there anything wrong with what he's asking me to do? And she remembered that she couldn't say the word 5 or she would fall asleep. So what she did is she said, "Well, Anansi, okay, I'll count and tell you how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the one you're sitting on." "No, no, 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 no," Anansi said. "You're not counting right. Do it again." And so Mrs. Goose said, "Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the one you're sitting on." Anansi said, "You don't know how to count. What you're supposed to do is say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5." And Anansi fell asleep. And Mrs. Goose went home with how many piles of corn? Do you want to say it and see what happened? That's our second story. Now, the third story that I have, it was a tradition that, I get all my notes here so I can get my pictures out and stuff. A tradition that the stories were called Anansi Stories. And there's a story, of course, to explain why these stories from Ghana are called Anansi Stories and why Anansi owns all the stories in the world. And I'm going to give you a couple of pictures here to get us started. In one part of the story, they talk about Anansi having a palm branch. So I wanted to give you a picture here of a palm tree so that you could have an idea of what it's like, one of those big leaves coming out and how long it is. Okay. And the second thing that I wanted to show you is a picture of an Odum tree, because that's a tree where Anansi is going to find one of the things he needs to capture. Okay, so this is what that looks like. One other thing that we're going to talk about is called a string creeper. And when we talk about that, I want you to think about a really, really leafy, but really, really strong vine that's kind of like a rope. Okay, and so I think I've shown you all I need. Are there any other notes? No, I think I'm good. Okay, so here's our story of how the stories became Nancy's, where they had originally been up in the sky. So the stories being up in the sky were owned by the sky god, Niami. And all of the other animals, all of the people, they all wanted to own the stories. They loved the idea of being able to tell them, being able to pass them along. But Niami had a very, very high price for the stories. One day, Anansi decided he wanted to get those stories. So he went up into the sky and he said, "Niami, what's the price? What do you have to do to get these stories? Now he said, well, it's a pretty high price, but it's not money. You have to bring to me 4 different things. First, you must bring me Onini, who is the python who swallows people whole. That's how big he is. Then you have to bring me Oseba. Now, Oseba is the leopard with teeth that are like spears, pointed and dangerous. Then you have to bring me Moboro. Now, Moboro are the hornets that swarm and sting. And fourth, you have to bring me Emoa Tia. Let me try to get this right. Emoa Tia. Emoa Tia, one of them, those are the fairies that people don't often see. Okay. And so, all right, said Anansi, I'll see what I can do. So he goes home to his wife, Aso, and he tells his wife what he has to do to get these stories. And he says, can you help me, Aso? Can you tell me how I can do this? And she thinks for a while and she says, well, if you go for Onini, the python first, you need to take with you some string creeper and a palm branch. And she explains to Anansi what he needs to do with them. And so he goes off. Now, he is down by the river and he takes this palm branch and he's just kind of standing there and he goes, could she be right? Well, maybe Aso was right about this, but I'm not really sure. And I wish I could get the answer to this. And all of a sudden, Anansi hears this voice, and it's the python. And he says, what is it you're mumbling all about? Talk to me about this, Anansi. What's going on? And he says, oh, you are the perfect person. I needed to see you, Python, because my wife and I are having this argument. My wife says that you are as long as a palm branch. And I say, I don't think you're quite as long as a palm branch. What do you think? Would you mind laying down next to this palm branch so that I can measure you? And then he says, okay, fine, I'll do that. And so he lays down next to his palm branch. Now it's a long branch. And Onini is stretching and stretching. And you're almost there. You're almost there. Anansi says, but how about I help you out? I can tie one end of you to this palm branch, and that way you only have to stretch in one direction. And you can then really stretch the end of the palm branch, and Anini just stretches and stretches and stretches and stretches. Doesn't quite make it. How about I try to tie you in the middle? Anansi says, and you can keep stretching even further. And Anini says, okay. And so finally, Anansi takes that string creeper and wraps that python from one end to the other end so he can't hurt Anansi. And then he takes his web and wraps a web around that, makes kind of a bag so that he can pull Onini all the way up to the sky to Naomi. And he gets the python there, and Naomi looks down and he nods. He acknowledges that, okay, he did Anansi did the first thing, but he says, what remains still remains, which means there's more that Anansi has to do. And Anansi goes home and he tells Aso that he was able to get the python. That was really, really great. But next he wants to go for the leopard. And what's he going to do? And Aso thinks for a minute and says, go dig a big hole. Anansi says, I got it. Know exactly what to do. And so he goes out and he digs this really, really deep hole. And he covers it with sticks. So you can't see where the hole is at. It's a trap, right? And he puts dust all over it, so it's hard to see that it's, that it's there. And sure enough, overnight, leopard is out hunting and boom, is down in the bottom of this trap. Anansi comes that next day and says, aha, gotcha. And leopard says, please, 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 please help me get out of here. Please, I don't want to die down here. And Anansi says, yeah, but if I let you out, well, you're going to kill me. You're going to eat me. And then you'll go find my family and you'll eat my family. And that just cannot happen. I can't have that happen. Oh, I will not kill you. I will not kill your family, the leopard says. Just get me out of here. And so Anansi has a plan. And there's a big, tall tree, but still a young tree. It's still bendy right next to that hole. And so he goes and he bends down the top of this tree. And he uses one of those string creepers to tie that top of the tree down. Now, the top of the tree goes just into that trap. Okay. And now that it's secured, Anansi goes and takes a second string creeper, wraps it around the top of the tree, and takes the other end and sends it down to the leopard. Says, now, leopard, I want you to put your front paws into the string creeper and the tree will help bring you up. Okay, but you got to be tied really tight to it so that it doesn't break when the tree goes straight again. And leopard says, okay. And he wraps this all around him. And Anansi takes a knife and he cuts the string creeper that's keeping the top of the tree down in the trap. And all of a sudden that tree goes, and leopard goes up into the air. And now he's hanging by his front paws from this tree. And Anansi goes up and he hits leopard in the head with the end of that big knife, and leopard goes unconscious. Once again, Anansi takes his web and he connects leopard to some of those sticks. So he's got a nice solid base there. And again, makes another bag and takes leopard up to Niami. And Niami nods, acknowledging that Anansi has gotten the second thing that he asked him to get, but repeats, what remains still remains. There's more for Anansi to get. Now, the next thing that Anansi is going to go after is those hornets, the hornets that swarm and sting. And he goes to Aso and he says, Aso, how am I going to get these hornets? They really sting and it's hard and it hurts and I don't want to get hurt. And Aso again thinks for a little while and says, okay, get a gourd full of water. Yeah, I think that'll do. And she explains to Anansi what he needs to do. So he takes this gourd of water and he walks into the forest and he happens to hear those hornets. And they're all just kind of hanging from this tree. And Anansi thinks for a minute and remembers what Aso told him to do. And so he takes some of the water and he puts it on the ground. And he takes some of the water and he puts it on the nest of the hornets. And he takes some of the water and he drips it onto the hornets while they're sleeping there on the tree branch. And then he takes the rest of the water and he pours it all over himself. He is dripping wet. And then he goes and he cuts off a banana leaf and he holds it over his head and he yells out, hornets, hornets, the rains have come, the rains have come. Look how wet I am. Look, your nest is wet. You are wet. You are going to have your wings hurt by the hard rains. You need to hide somewhere until the rains are over. And the hornets all look around and they say, Anansi, where should we hide? And he says, oh, there's a gourd right here. Go into this gourd. And they go flying into that gourd. And again, Anansi makes a web and he takes it and he covers that hole at the top of the gourd so they can't get out. And the gourd goes up into the sky and Niami looks and he nods. He acknowledges the fact that Anansi now has 3 of the 4 things that he is supposed to capture. And he says, what remains still remains. And Anansi says, okay, I need to go and get this fourth thing. Now, the fourth thing is one of these fairies that aren't seen very often. And he goes to Aso and he says, Aso, we really got to think, meaning she has to think, and come up with a really good idea of what we're going to do to capture this fairy. And so Aso thinks, and she says, now you're going to need to get some more things to get ready for this one. You're going to need some more string creeper. You're going to need some yams. You're going to need some of that sticky sap that comes from trees. And you're going to need an aqua doll. Now, an aqua doll is a wooden doll. It's got a great big head. It's very flat. It's got a great big head. It's got two arms sticking straight out, and it's kind of on a handle. And these dolls are made for women who would like to have children. And she takes good care of this doll, and the gods then help her to get pregnant and have her own children. And after the woman has a child, often she will give the doll to the child to have as a plaything. So this plan on how to get this fairy is a little bit complicated, but Anansi gathers up all the things that Aso told him to get, and he goes off. Now he happens to know that the fairies like to be near these Odum trees, like the one that I showed you. And so he goes, and what he does is he takes this doll and he puts some string creeper around its neck and has enough that he can hide back in the brush and still be holding on to the end of that string creeper. He takes some of that sticky sap that Aso told him to get from the tree and put the sticky sap all over this doll. And then he takes a yam and he pounds it all up, and he puts some of that, a big pile of that, a little bit on the hand of the doll, but also the rest in this pot that sits right at the bottom of where the doll is being stood up. Everything's ready. Anansi's hiding, and just so happens that two of these fairies show up by this tree. And when they get near the tree, they see this wonderful pounded yams, and it smells really good. And the fairies talk to the doll and they say, could we have some of those yams? And so Anansi's got this string creeper, right, that is connected to the doll. And so he makes the doll move a little bit so it looks like the doll is saying yes. And so the fairies come over and they have some of these yams, and they're really, really good. And at the end, the fairies say, well, thank you very much for sharing. That was very, very nice of you. Well, of course, the doll can't talk. And so there's this silence. And one of the fairies turns to the other and says, I said, thank you. And she didn't say a thing. I know, that's so rude, said the other fairy. You need to slap her on the cheek. And so the fairy slaps the doll on the cheek. But remember, there's this sticky sap on it. And so the fairy is now stuck to this doll. And the other fairy says, well, hit her again. She's being rude. And boom, the fairy hits the doll in the other cheek. So now both hands are stuck to this doll. And the fairy's getting really, really mad. So she kicks the doll, and that foot sticks to the doll too. And when she kicks with the other one, now both hands and both feet are stuck to this doll. And the only other thing that the fairy can think of is she, boom, hits her with her stomach. And now she is totally stuck to this doll and she can't get away. Well, it's now Anansi's time, and he comes out and he wraps the rest of that string creeper around the fairy, and once again puts a web around her to make sure that she can't escape, and boom, flies that fairy up to the sky to Niame. Yami looks, Yami nods. Yes, Anansi, you have made the full payment. And so he calls together the nobles and he says, Anansi has made the full payment for these stories. And all agree that the stories must go to him. And so there is this great pot, great clay pot with all the stories in it, and it is given to Anansi, and he brings it down from the sky and takes it into his house. And he and Aso, they learn all of these stories and they tell them, they share them, and they spread and they spread and they spread. And you know that they are still being spread today, because if you go out, you will see one of Anansi's webs that he's made while he's been telling his stories. Now, if you've been listening to me tell stories for a long time, you may have already heard me tell a story that was very, very similar to that. Now, it wasn't Anansi who was trying to get something, it was Hare. And Hare had to get the teeth of the leopard and had to get the very, very long mambo snake and had to get all the little birds of the forest. And Hare was just as clever as Anansi was. I have a feeling this story, the one about the hare, came from Liberia, which is not that far away from from Ghana. And so I have a feeling that it passed along, and like playing telephone, whenever a story is told, it changes a bit. So it went from a Nazi story to a hare story. Also, I thought it was really interesting that Aso was really the one who had a lot of wisdom. And I have a feeling that when Anansi in that first story took that gourd and poured all the wisdom out, the wind blew a lot of it to his wife, which I think was a very good thing for Anansi. So that's the end of our stories for today. I hope you will join me next Wednesday at 1:15, and who knows where those stories are going to be from. I'd like you to have a suggestion. Is there a certain kind of story you'd like to hear, or a story from a certain place you'd like to hear? I'm very, very happy to do more research and find more stories. Everybody take care. It's been good to see you.